Okay, now if we're going to go ahead and get started, what we need to do is make sure that we have our tools put out and within reach, and make sure we have them to work with. So start off with some masking tape, because we are going to use this when we make our first type of weathering, which is the door scratches or other kinds of scratches on the side of a box car or hopper car, freight car, any kind of freight car. So I like to use the blue tape. You don't even need to worry about this stuff really sealing, so don't get carried away with buying the more expensive frog tape or anything else that seals the edges by itself. Just the blue tape is good. Now, if you happen to use regular masking tape, I would definitely make sure that I had a piece of glass or plastic or metal, a metal sheet around, so that you can take a piece of regular masking tape, put it down on the surface of the glass, and then peel it off. And what that'll do is take off quite a bit of the really, really sticky glue that's in the regular masking tape, because the last thing you want to do is start removing paint from your masking. So that's why I like to use the blue stuff, because it really doesn't normally do that. Now, the other thing that we're going to need, as I had mentioned before, is some distilled water. Now, next time you're at the grocery store or the drugstore or something, pick a gallon of this stuff up. The reason why you want to use distilled water instead of regular tap water is because, of course, regular tap water has chemicals, especially chlorines and fluorides and things like that, that are going to definitely react to your paint, and we don't want that to happen. So distilled water has removed all that kind of stuff. It usually only costs about $1 a gallon, and believe me, a gallon will last you a very long time. Now, the other thing, of course, is we need something to apply and, in effect, remove the paint. So we can start with brushes. And, of course, what you want to do is find yourself some very, very, very small bristle brushes to begin with. And these are not too bad. They're fairly small. I would even use some that's even smaller than these. Okay, this would be good for like N scale and HO scale, and then maybe a little bit bigger if you're going to move on up into like a O scale. That's primarily used to apply. Then you can, if you go to Hobby Lobby or Michael's or any of the other craft stores, go to the art departments, and you're going to find some really, really good deals normally on all different size brushes. So go ahead and buy yourself an assortment. I've picked up some tremendous assortments of brushes. I think this was one assortment. You can see I've already pulled out quite a few. And on discount, this was only like $6 or $7 for all of these brushes. So pick yourself up some brushes. This one's kind of interesting. You can see it has a serrated type end on it. Very nice flat brush. This is great for doing streaks. So I'll take a look at that a little bit later. The other thing that you want to consider is you don't necessarily want too soft of a brush, because what we're going to do is we're going to try and drag the paint diluted across the surface. So they want to be fairly stiff, not rock hard stiff by any means, but fairly stiff. So, and you can vary these in different sizes for use, for the different size streakings, and like HO and N gauge, and on up into some of the larger streaking in HO and some of the smaller streaking in O gauge. But then, of course, remember, you could also use these for G-gauge. Not really. Anyway, then I also have an assortment of other kinds of paint applicators, and most of these really won't cost you anything. Here's a piece of wire that works terrific for putting on dots of paint. Some of these little flathead nails, nice surface there for applying paint, and even the tip of the nail works terrific. But then don't throw away all those little scraps of styrene of various sizes. Those make great applicators. And even better than that are your wood pieces. And especially because with wood, this is fun, and we'll work with this. You can break these and get different shapes, so the paint will be applied to the surface in irregular patterns. I've also made sure that we have some Q-tips and toothpicks, and I use a lot of toothpicks. Not so much with the real tip point, but again, you just take and you break off the tip, and we use that part, especially with those little hairs hanging out. That is terrific. And then, you know, like I said, don't throw anything out. I was making some trees the other day, and here's some snippings of some of the branches that I cut off of Realtree, because I use Realtrees for armatures. But these make great paint applicators too, and of course, honestly, they come in all different sizes and shapes. So once we've got that put together, oh, looked right at it, we're going to need some kind of a mixing tray and a place to store your distilled water that is readily accessible for your brushes, because we're going to be doing a lot of dipping in water, wiping the brush clean, dipping it back in the paint, diluting it, so on and so forth. So get yourself something. I like these. These were those balanced break cheese and cracker or something things my wife likes. So I saved a bunch of those. Otherwise, just have some little cups. You know, something else that works well if you have them laying around are these little parts boxes, because you got all these compartments, okay, and you know, fill them all up with water to start with, and then they'll start getting dirtier and dirtier and dirtier, which is great to your advantage, because they can actually turn into washes, and that's something else again that I'll cover at a later time. So take advantage of what you got. You don't have to go crazy and go out and buy things. Probably the only thing you're going to have to buy is some paint and a couple of brushes. Everything else is stuff that you probably have laying around the house or the workbench. Okay? Now, our paints. My two primary paints that I'm going to be working with are Modelmaster acrylic. And I like the acrylics because it's so easy to clean up, so easy to work with. I have worked with oils. The thing about oils is they probably do a little bit nicer job, okay, especially for rust. But the acrylics are being manufactured now that are coming pretty close to the quality of the oils. But the acrylics are so much easier to work with. So these are the two colors that you're going to definitely use the most of. The burnt umber, which is Modelmaster 4605, and burnt sienna, which is Modelmaster 4607. So we're going to use a lot of these two. And then we're going to supplement with some others like flat white. Now, the surprising thing was I used up all my flat white, and flat white works great, okay? But I've had a tendency to start using more often like a light gray, which is also a flat. and that's Model Master 4765, or there's another one, Camouflage Gray. These are obviously aircraft paints, and this one is 4766, which we'll use. And then there's our favorite as far as grays are concerned. This is not really a black, it's a gray, and as you can see, this is again an acrylic, and most of us remember it from the good old Folkwell days, and that's grimy black. And fortunately, right now, Model Master still makes it. Now, I know we don't need to get into an argument about the fact that Rust-Oleum bought them out years ago, and now they've announced that they're eliminating the Model Master series of paints, and that's true. But hopefully, they're going to maintain this stuff under the labeling of testers instead of a Model Master type thing. Or I don't care what they call it, as long as certainly they maintain the colors for us. So if nothing else, pick this stuff up when you see it today. It lasts quite a while if you don't open it. Later on we might use some flat aluminum, and just as an aside, Model Master did start getting involved in some acrylic washes, so if you find these, because it's my understanding the only acrylic wash that is currently inventoried by Model Master is black. But they did some browns and some greens and some grays, off-whites. If you see these, and you can see the label, it's in the Model Master acrylic, but it has this green panel that says acrylic wash. You see this stuff, pick it up. It's really good stuff to work with, and hopefully later on, maybe not in this little seminar, but another one, I'm going to really get involved with talking to you about washes and what we can and can't do. Now, one more paint that I would recommend that you keep in your arsenal, especially for weathering purposes, is the Model Master Acrylic Railroad Tie Brown. Okay, and its number is 4885. This is a great, dirty, grimy, brownish, muddish, oilish type of a paint that we can use for a lot of different things. Now that said, if you take a closer look here, and this is the burnt umber, okay? Look at the closeness of these colors. Alright? Yeah, they're almost identical. This Railroad Tie Brown does have a little bit more black in it than the burnt umber. So like I said, here's your two primaries right here. Burnt sienna, burnt umber. Okay? And you see that's what they look like from the top. So we got dark old rust and a lighter, more new rust to work with. Maybe if we get a chance and I start doing a couple of more of these, I'm going to show you how we can actually do weathering and not touch any of these specialty colors, where you can just go to an artist supply and pick up some cheap acrylic tube paint, and using the primary colors, white, red, yellow, and blue, those and red. So those four or five colors, I'll show you how you can do some fantastic overall weathering, much like a wash, but gives you a much different thing. Anyway, we can talk about that at a different time. Okay, so what we can do is let's get started on our first exercise, which will be trying to make some simulated scrapes on the sides of the freight car that have rusted. Some plastic, and cut this off of various size cookie containers that you get at the supermarket. You know, those clear plastic food containers, real light gauge material. Give it a quick coat of red oxide primer. On that, I put some outlines of boxcars. Now, this is HO, so typically you're talking about 1.5 inches tall by about, what is that, 5.5 inches long for a 40-foot boxcar, okay? It certainly doesn't need to be exact. All we're going to do is practice. This seems to be a little bit less intimidating to, in effect, screw up than even taking a very inexpensive train set type boxcar like this one and starting to put some of the heavy duty weathering onto it. Okay, later on we'll take a look at working with an actual car like this, and then even once we feel more confident, we'll move up to some Athearn blue box cars, and then we can get all the way up to some scale trains type stuff. How's that? So next time you're at a garage sale and you happen to see some of these, don't overlook them. Grab them, and then you'll have something to really practice with. You can even go so far to stimulate your work by lettering up some of these false boxcar sides. Okay, let's give this a try. We'll do our first scratch across the side of a boxcar. So I'm going to take a short piece of tape. What you do is you go ahead and put it down onto the surface. Now here's where you do have to pay attention, because you want to make sure that the bottom edge of this tape is as close to being exactly level to the bottom edge of the car as possible. Slightly slanted lines are okay, but if there's any great angle, then you really start running into some perception problems. Next, I'm going to take my burnt umber. I'm using a broken off toothpick, and notice what I'm doing here. I'm just using the paint out of the lid. You know, when you shake it up, you get that paint up there, and that's all you need. So what we're going to try and do here is we're just going to try and put tiny little pieces of paint. We're not going to paint the edge. We're going to put tiny little pieces of this paint. This is where you do not want to overdo it. So very carefully, right on the edge of the tape, I'm going to put some dots. And I've spaced them out a little bit. And actually, at the beginning on my left, I've made them a little bit heavier and then kind of made smaller and smaller dots as I moved to the right. Then I'm going to take just a little bit of the lighter rust color, which of course is the burnt sienna, and I'm going to put some of that on there. Now, if you feel like you've overloaded the tip of your toothpick, which is very easy to do, just take a nice piece of paper towel and dab it. And then go ahead, and what I'm doing here is I'm just putting a little touch of the burnt sienna onto the edge of the tape. So this is what we want to try and end up having. Now don't be necessarily real anxious to start grabbing your brush and making the vertical strokes to show the streaks of rust. Let this paint set up just a little bit as far as air dry is concerned. Then we can take our brush, and in this case I'm using this, it's about 1/4 inch, and it's fairly stiff bristled brush. I'll put it in some water and get rid of the excess water on a paper towel. Then, using very, very light poking technique, I'm going to kind of mix that paint of the two colors onto the tape. Now I haven't really dragged it, I just poked it to kind of mix them up a little bit and also help that paint to start its drying process. Then re-wet my brush, get rid of the excess. Now, using very, very light vertical strokes, I'll go ahead and bring that paint down onto the surface of the edge, starting with the left, making it a little bit further down and moving right. Now, this is what I've got, and you can see that over here on the left I brought it all the way down to the bottom edge. If I don't like that, take your brush again out of the water, make it fairly wet, and go back over that left side. And what I've done is I've actually removed the paint from that edge. Now what you can do is you can remove this, or you can let this dry and see if it is exactly what you want, because it's very difficult to put the tape back on and get the same exact edge. So we can let that one dry out a little bit and see what's going on. If you have a hair dryer or something, you can speed this process up. Okay, through the magic of editing, we just let that dry out a little bit. Now on this particular one, I haven't got much paint on there. However, there is a line, so let me remove the tape here, and you can see it. Now see how there is just that real nice faint line. See, in contrast to some of these others, you can see these are a little bit heavier. They get heavier because I've used more paint. So it's up to you. So let's try it one more time and see what we can come out with. Just going to go over to this side just for kicks. Again, I start with my burnt umber. Now, I've got too much on here, so I just used a paper towel to get rid of a lot of it. So yeah, and this time I'm putting on just a touch more paint than I did on the one that was on the right. Some of the lighter color on. There we go. Now, take my brush again, into the water, and dab. Mix that paint. Yeah. There. Now, I'm going to go ahead and try her again. Just short, vertical strokes. There. And you can see. Now, if you get some of that paint trailing down here on an edge that you may or may not like, you'll have to see what this looks like after it dries. But if you don't necessarily like it, take a clean piece of paper towel and bring it further down on the surface of the side. Now, we're going to let this one dry out, but I'll pull that off to show you. You can see this is a little bit of a heavier line. So that's pretty much all there is to the technique. So go ahead, get yourself a worksheet, as I would refer to it, and give it a try. It's easy. All you need to do is practice a little bit, and then you're going to be ready to jump right into those box cars and other freight cars that are running on your layout as far as scratches are concerned. Okay, let's try another one. I'll try and get this a little bit closer to the lens of the camera after I get going here. So let's put our masking tape on, remembering keeping it as parallel to the bottom edge of the car as possible. And, you know, if all else fails, there's always a roller. Now, I'll go ahead and put some of the burnt umber onto the bottom edge of the tape. And then I'll put a little bit of the burnt sienna onto the bottom edge of the tape, like that. And I think you can see what that looks like. Then, as we've done before, wet brush. I'm going to dab that in, which again fills in the space. It kind of mixes up the paint a bit. Clean brush, and then I can do my downward or vertical scraping or dripping, running, trying to keep these as vertical as possible. And that's all there is to that. So this is what it's going to look like from here. And then we'll pull the tape off, and you can see that we have a scratch or scrape with the rust flowing down. Now, where this is dark, a lot of this is going to dry out because remember, it's primarily water, but it does have the paint pigment mixed into it. So we'll let that dry out after a little bit. Okay, now you can see this is the one that I just did, and you can see the variations on that. Here's the other worksheet, test sheet that I was working with earlier, and you can see some of those different. There's the one that was over on the left, and these were the ones that were on the right. So go ahead and give it a shot. I think you'll find that it's a lot of fun just to go ahead and give it a try. Now here's a G-gauge car that I have been practicing with. This is strictly my practice car. I made some decals, tried those, and here you can see the scrape line. This is what we're going to look at next. These spots where we've had rust show up from the paint chipping, and then of course running down because of rain and weather and things like that. So you can see some variations on the scratch lines and also on the paint or the rust drop lines. Now, to make those spots on the side, is actually a simpler process than doing the scratch lines, because we don't have to worry about getting the tape on there and getting the bottom edge of the tape loaded correctly with paint. So what we'll do now is we'll just take our work piece, and I take I like, again, toothpick, or you can start experimenting with some of the other types of applicators. Like, here's the piece of wire, for instance. We can take that, and all we need to do is put a drop, just a spot of, and again I'm using the burnt umber, the dark, and I'll show you what we'll do a little bit later. Now, you can vary these in size and certainly vary them in position. There, I've just added 3. Now, you can, if you want, also put some of the lighter coloring on there, and I'll do that in one spot. Now notice I'm using just the very tip of a new toothpick, so I'll pick up some paint on it, and I'm going to try and center that right there on that burnt umber one. Now what I'm doing is I'm actually making that dot a little bit bigger, and I've made it a little bit more oval. Okay? Then I take my brush, same brush I've been using, or you can change up on brushes. Sometimes you may find that instead of a stiff brush like we used to put the scratch lines in, you may want to use and try a softer brush. But I'm going to load it up with water, and then just touching the brush immediately above the dot of paint pigment, go ahead and draw it straight down, just like that. Just one nice quick move. And then just set those aside and let them dry. And that's all there is to doing the rusted spot areas where you have the bleeding of the rust down across the surface of your boxcar side or other type of freight car side. Now you can vary that, and one of the things that we can do is use a little bit of a different applicator. In fact, I'll go a little bit crazy. I'm going to use a Q-tip here, and I'm going to put a relatively large splotch, just like that. And then I'm going to also, because I like to also allow it to have a little bit of the lighter color rust on there. So I put some of the burnt sienna onto there too. Now, this is where I'm going to want to make sure that this dries just a little bit, so it's not brand new, fresh, really liquid paint. And then I'm going to use a little bit different approach here. I'm going to use a little bit softer brush. This one's softer. I'm going to wet that up, and then I'm going to go ahead and very quickly let that come down. Sometimes you twist the brush. Now just, it doesn't look really great right now because you see all of the water. Let that dry, and you're going to see that it ends up having a very nice technique. Now, something else that you can also start experimenting with while you're working on this is, this brush right now is actually loaded with some pigment. So you can always, like here on the bottom edges of the car, just kind of do that to it. It's almost like cleaning your brush on the bottom edge of the car. And that'll be picking up like some very, very light applications of a dirt grime type of a thing. And we'll let that dry out, and we'll come back to that in just a little bit. Well, some of the other things that you can do, as you can see here, is I loaded the top edge here of the car with some of the paint pigment, the burnt umber, followed on top by the burnt sienna, and then I dragged it down on an angle on one of the ribs. I also did the same thing on the other end, dragging it straight down. So you can have a lot of fun with these pigments and getting some of this rust onto your various freight cars. Now, let's take a look here at the piece that we just did. It's not even quite dry yet, unfortunately. I should have waited. But you can see where our rust spots were, and then I dragged them down, showing you here. And there's that larger one. Now when that dries fully, that's going to be really an interesting spot on the side of the car. What's interesting is I put it over there because what I would be ending up doing there is covering some of the lettering, and that's a whole nother problem with weathering, is some of the factory lettering nowadays is coming out so well, it is so opaque and in effect thick on the surface. When you weather, the lettering still stays bright and shiny underneath. So if you cover it with these kinds of deformities, as far as like rust and things, and then later on in this series I'll also talk to you specifically about how we can make factory painted leathering definitely look more weathered by applying a couple of other techniques. Now here I've added a few of those techniques to one of those inexpensive boxcars that's not quite lettered correctly anyway, but something to work with, especially because obviously it's a lighter color than the red oxide that I was using previously. Everything is pretty nice. I mean, I like what's happened here. You can see the scrape. Now I've taken some of the dots, like here, and here, and here. These are just rust spots. Even though I washed them over, they didn't really streak, which is fine, and that's something that is very prototypical. Then I made larger dots, like here, up here on this on the top edge of the roof, and brought those down. And you can see this is rusting areas, especially where there's joints, or down here on the bottom edge of the door, so you can do that kind of a thing. Now I tried a larger spot here, and now I just plain don't like it. It just doesn't look right. It's just a big blob of the burnt umber paint, even though I've streaked it and put a little bit of the burnt sienna on top. I still don't like it. It almost looks like, well, it looks like a 3D blob of paint on the side. So this is where I take some Windex and I'll spray that on to a paper towel. You get the paper towel nice and wet. Let that flow in so it isn't dripping like that. Just kind of get that paper towel so I can use it, and I've brought it down into a smaller folded area. Now what I can do is very carefully is rub that area. And every time you rub, you're taking off the slightest little bit of the paint. Don't rub too hard. Just let it work. Let it do its thing. Let the Windex attack the paint and bring it off a fraction at a time. And when you're doing this, you'll start to see it become less and less opaque, and it will of course pick up the pigment onto the paper towel. So instead of spreading the pigment anymore, I just go ahead, fold that over again, bring that down, and you can bring it down to just about any place you want. Now, I'll let that one dry out. Now it looks much better as far as rust and a rust streaking area. You can see that it's kind of broken up the edges, so there are no really finely defined edges. It just kind of looks like rust coming up through the paint.